In the spring of 1943, a battle-hardened veteran of Rommel's Africa Corps stepped off a train at Camp Aliceville, Alabama. He braced himself for the brutal gulags promised by Goebbels' propaganda. Instead, a guard handed him a booklet of canteen coupons and pointed him toward a camp store overflowing with ice cream, tobacco, fresh fruit, and chilled Coca-Cola. Convinced this was an elaborate psychological trap, the deeply indoctrinated soldier hesitated, refusing to buy a thing. Why would a nation locked in a total global war seemingly waste precious resources to pamper its most dangerous enemies, especially when its own citizens back home faced strict food rationing? This single soldier's disbelief at Camp Aliceville was not an isolated anomaly. By the time the guns fell silent in Europe, the United States was quietly housing and employing a staggering number of German prisoners of war on its own soil. More than 370,000 men. These were highly trained, deeply indoctrinated veterans of the Third Reich, suddenly transplanted into the rural heartland of American capitalism. What unfolded behind the barbed wire of these stateside camps remains one of the most surreal and fiercely debated experiments of the Second World War. We are going to investigate exactly what happened when the rigid, fascist ideology of the German military collided head-on with the overwhelming reality of American consumerism and wage labor. Was this controversial, so-called ice cream treatment simply a naive logistical blunder by a nation unprepared for the realities of mass captivity? Was it a strict, hyper-legalistic adherence to the international rules of the Geneva Convention? Or did the War Department accidentally stumble upon a devastatingly effective psychological weapon? To uncover the truth, we have to look past the bizarre imagery of combat veterans buying candy. We need to examine the functioning microeconomies established inside these camps, the daily wages these captive men earned, and the profound cognitive dissonance triggered by an enemy society operating at peak industrial capacity. Ultimately, we are going to answer one crucial question. Did access to simple American sweets and a thriving local economy actually play a tangible role in breaking the deeply entrenched fascist mindset of the German soldier? The answer to how this bizarre reality came to be begins not with a grand psychological strategy, but with a massive, cascading logistical crisis. In May 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa collapsed, surrendering over 250,000 German and Italian troops to the Allies. This sudden windfall of prisoners created an immediate strategic nightmare. Great Britain, battered by years of bombing, heavily rationed, and actively preparing as the staging ground for the future invasion of Europe, simply could not absorb them. They lacked the housing, the food, and the manpower to guard such a massive influx of highly trained enemy combatants. Prime Minister Winston Churchill urgently appealed to Washington to take the burden. Initially, the United States War Department, led by Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, fiercely opposed the idea of bringing the enemy to the American homeland. The security risks, the threat of espionage, and the potential for mass escapes were considered too high. But military logistics ruthlessly override political hesitations. The lifeblood of the Allied war effort was the vast fleet of American Liberty ships, endlessly crossing the Atlantic, packed with troops, tanks, and munitions. Once they unloaded in Europe and North Africa, these immense cargo ships were making the dangerous return voyage to the United States largely empty. Using this returning fleet as floating prison transports solved the European bottleneck without demanding a single extra vessel from the strained Allied shipping capacity. Throughout the summer of 1943, tens of thousands of German soldiers began disembarking at ports in New York, Boston, and Virginia. They were swiftly loaded onto heavily guarded trains with the blinds drawn and shipped deep into the American interior. The War Department desperately wanted this massive operation kept out of the spotlight. The American public was subjected to relentless blackout drills and strict rationing. The optics of healthy, defiant German soldiers walking on American soil was a volatile political powder keg. They were hidden away in newly constructed, sprawling camps in remote rural areas across the South, the Southwest, and the Great Plains. But as the military scrambled to build these internment centers, a second, parallel crisis was paralyzing the American home front. The United States was experiencing a crippling domestic labor shortage. The military draft had systematically pulled millions of able-bodied American men out of the workforce and shipped them overseas. The agricultural sector, the very engine feeding the Allied armies, was teetering on the brink of collapse. Crops were rotting in the fields across the Midwest and the South. Canneries, lumber camps, and packing plants were operating at a fraction of their necessary capacity. The nation was fighting a global war of industrial production, and it was rapidly running out of hands to do the work. The military looked at the agricultural crisis, and then looked at the hundreds of thousands of idle, physically fit German soldiers sitting in their newly constructed camps. The solution was obvious: put the prisoners to work. But this is exactly where the American military command found itself bound by a rigid, uncompromising set of international laws. The United States was a strict signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The War Department was terrified that any perceived mistreatment of German prisoners in America would result in brutal, immediate retaliation against American G is currently starving in German stalags across Europe. To utilize this captive workforce legally, the United States had to follow the treaty to the absolute letter. The rules were clear. Prisoners could not be forced to work in dangerous conditions, and they could not manufacture munitions or perform tasks directly related to military operations. Most importantly, if they worked, they had to be paid. Furthermore, the Geneva Convention explicitly dictated that the housing, food rations, and overall living conditions of prisoners of war must be exactly equal to those of the holding nation's own rear echelon troops. Because the United States military fed and housed its base camp soldiers exceptionally well, international law demanded that captured German soldiers receive that exact same high standard of living. This legal requirement created an agonizing political dilemma for the Provost Marshal General's office, the military branch tasked with managing the camps. Out in the civilian world, American families were dealing with strict rationing boards. Gasoline, tires, sugar, coffee, butter, and meat were all tightly restricted by the government. Yet, just a few miles away, behind barbed wire fences, German soldiers were legally entitled to the exact caloric intake of an American GI. The War Department knew that if the American public discovered that enemy combatants, the very men who had just been shooting at their sons in Tunisia, were eating fresh meat and sleeping on clean linens while civilians were sacrificing, the political backlash would be unsurvivable. To manage this tension, the military imposed a veil of operational secrecy over the camps. Local newspapers were actively discouraged from reporting on the daily menus or the infrastructure of the compounds. The military constructed a vast, parallel system of supply and administration designed to fulfill international legal obligations in total isolation from the American civilian economy. Inside the wire, the administration meticulously established the required labor and wage infrastructure. Prisoners who volunteered for agricultural or non-military industrial labor were contracted out to local farmers and businesses. To prevent the prisoners from undercutting American workers, civilian employers paid the U.S. government the prevailing local wage for the labor. The military, in turn, credited the working prisoners a legally mandated wage, typically 80 cents a day. But to prevent escapes and sabotage, the prisoners were obviously not paid in hard American currency. Instead, they were issued specially printed paper chits, or booklets of canteen coupons, valid only inside the camp's enclosed economy. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic compliance. The War Department had solved the British housing crisis, neutralized the empty shipping problem, alleviated the domestic agricultural labor shortage, and flawlessly adhered to the 1929 Geneva Convention. The infrastructure was set up perfectly, strictly by the book, designed simply to keep the prisoners secure, fed, and legally employed until the war ended. But in their rush to fulfill international treaties and solve logistical headaches, the American military administration completely overlooked the psychological implications of their own system. By establishing camp stores and issuing wages in canteen coupons, they were completely unaware that they had just handed real, functioning economic purchasing power directly into the hands of men specifically trained to despise and destroy democratic societies. When the exhausted Africa Corps veteran returned from a 10-hour shift picking cotton in Texas or harvesting peanuts in Georgia, he was handed his wages. 80 cents a day in government-issued canteen coupons. To the War Department, it was merely an accounting mechanism designed to adhere strictly to international law. To the German prisoner, it was the spark of a profound ideological crisis. With these booklets of chits in hand, the captives walked into the camp exchange, known as the PX. What they encountered inside those simple wooden buildings shattered years of relentless state propaganda. For a decade, Joseph Goebbels and the Ministry of Public Enlightenment had painted the United States as a degenerate, crumbling plutocracy, a racially mixed society paralyzed by rationing and weakness, fundamentally incapable of sustaining a two-front war. Yet, the shelves before them groaned under the weight of items considered absolute luxuries even in pre-war Germany. Prisoners found they could purchase unrestricted quantities of Hershey's chocolate, fresh citrus from Florida, high-grade Virginia tobacco, and standardized, incredibly durable denim work clothes. And then there was the soda. Coca-Cola and Dr. Pepper were stacked in massive chilled crates. A prisoner could easily buy 3, 4, or 5 bottles a day without making a dent in the camp's supply. Ice cream, a delicacy virtually non-existent in the battered cities of the Reich, was scooped out by the gallon. Because the Geneva Convention guaranteed equal treatment to American rear-echelon troops, some camp commanders even allowed prisoners to pool their coupons to order specialized goods directly from Sears Roebuck catalogs. Captive men were buying wristwatches, fountain pens, and hair pomade, while their families back in Dresden and Berlin were huddled in bomb shelters, subsisting on sawdust bread, synthetic ersatz coffee, and shrinking rations. This material reality hit the average Wehrmacht conscript like a physical blow. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. How could a nation fighting a brutal war in both the Pacific and Europe afford to produce this endless mountain of sugar, milk, and glass bottles? If the American economy was truly on the verge of collapse, why were they pampering their sworn enemies with fresh meat and chilled sweets? It was not merely the nutritional value of the food that did the psychological damage. It was the brutal, inescapable math of industrial logistics. A German soldier staring at an endless, unbroken supply of Coca-Cola in a rural Alabama prison camp was forced to confront a terrifying logical leap. If the Americans can afford to waste this much logistical effort, shipping capacity, and manufacturing power on trivial comforts for their prisoners, what must their tank factories look like? What must their aircraft production lines be churning out? The horrifying realization began to creep into the barracks that their highest leadership in Berlin had fundamentally, perhaps fatally, lied to them about the enemy's true economic and industrial capacity. The sheer, casual abundance of the camp store began to quietly dissolve the ideological armor of the average German conscript. They were getting comfortable, well-fed, and slowly sedated by the predictable rhythms of American wage labor and consumerism. But this silent psychological erosion did not go unnoticed. Deep inside the barracks, mixed among the weary draftees and ordinary soldiers, were the true believers, the hardened Africa Corps non-commissioned officers, the fanatic U-boat crews, and the loyal, deeply indoctrinated party men saw exactly what the ice cream, the denim, and the 80-cent wages were doing to the fighting spirit of their troops. And these hardcore fascist elements inside the camps were absolutely not about to let a bottle of soda destroy the discipline of the Third Reich. The battle lines of this new ideological war were drawn at the gates of the camp motor pools. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., across the sprawling American Midwest, the Deep South, and the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, thousands of German prisoners were systematically loaded onto fleets of open-bed Ford and Chevrolet trucks. They were driven out of the heavily guarded, barbed wire enclosures of massive installations like Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Concordia in Kansas, or Camp Aliceville in Alabama, heading deep into the vast, open, agricultural heartland of the United States. This daily, rumbling commute became their primary, unfiltered window into the American civilian mind. The War Department had explicitly forbidden any unnecessary fraternization between the enemy combatants and the local population, issuing strict directives to civilian employers to keep their distance. But in the reality of the sprawling fields of sugar beets, the endless rows of cotton, and the dense pine forests of the lumber industry, policing casual everyday conversation was practically impossible. When a seasoned Wehrmacht conscript was handed a heavy iron hoe and told to work a 12-hour shift alongside an American civilian farmer, he fully expected to meet a downtrodden, heavily regulated, and terrified peasant. This was the exact image Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had painstakingly constructed for a decade: an America paralyzed by racial strife, crushed by capitalist exploitation, and strictly managed by a dictatorial wartime government. Instead, the German soldiers met fiercely independent landowners who drove their own tractors, casually smoked Lucky Strikes, and spoke their minds without ever glancing over their shoulders in fear. The prisoners engaged in prolonged, quiet, and deeply shocking observation of a society that functioned seamlessly and with massive industrial output without the iron grip of a dictator. They listened in stunned disbelief as ordinary American farmers openly criticized President Franklin D. Roosevelt, loudly complained about government rationing policies, and mocked their own local politicians over shared lunches in the shade of the transport trucks. In the Third Reich, such casual public treason would instantly result of a midnight visit from the Gestapo, a swift trial, and a one-way ticket to a concentration camp. Here, in the dusty fields of Georgia or the orchards of California, it was just idle Tuesday morning chatter. The German soldiers noticed something else, too: the absolute, perplexing lack of pervasive fear. The American military guards assigned to oversee these distant work details were rarely frontline combat troops. They were often older men, combat-wounded veterans sent home to recover, or local state militiamen. These guards were remarkably relaxed, frequently leaning their heavy M1 Garand rifles against a nearby tree to sit in the shade, trusting the sheer, overwhelming vastness of the American landscape to act as the true prison wall. To the ordinary German draftee, raised in a society of block wardens and secret police, this casual trust was intoxicating. They were experiencing firsthand the terrifying, quiet resilience of a free society. But back inside the heavily fortified compounds, a different, far more dangerous faction of the German military was observing this exact same casual American behavior and drawing a dangerously different conclusion. Inside the segregated officer compounds, the atmosphere was rigidly, aggressively different. High-ranking commanders, captured generals of the Africa Corps, and elite, ideologically pure U-boat captains purposefully isolated themselves from the enlisted men. They observed the relaxed American camp life, the abundance of the canteens, and the casual posture of the guards with absolute, sneering disdain. Initially, they viewed the overflowing camp stores and the lack of severe physical punishment not as signs of industrial strength, but as glaring, undeniable proof of democratic weakness. To a Prussian-trained officer, a guard who leaned his rifle against a tree was undisciplined, soft, and unworthy of military respect. They convinced themselves that the ice cream, the durable denim work clothes, and the 80-cent daily wages were desperate, pathetic attempts by a weak, mongrel nation to buy the compliance of a superior martial race. They strutted around their compounds in pristine uniforms, demanding sharp salutes from their men, and trying to maintain the exact, rigid military hierarchies that had just been shattered on the battlefields of North Africa. They believed the Americans were too cowardly to enforce true discipline, misinterpreting basic humanitarian compliance with the Geneva Convention as a fundamental flaw in the American character. This arrogant underestimation, however, slowly began to fracture under the crushing, undeniable weight of American logistics. The turning point for the officers rarely came from a conversation with their captors. It came from silently watching the horizon. From the elevated vantage points of their compounds, captured German strategists could clearly see the American railway network in perpetual motion. They spent hours meticulously counting the endless trains rolling past the perimeter wire. They logged the flat cars loaded with freshly minted Sherman tanks, the boxcars packed with thousands of tons of ammunition, and the miles of black oil tanker cars moving unhindered day and night without a single air raid siren forcing them to stop. They began to calculate the sheer volume of fuel consumption required merely to transport hundreds of prisoners on daily agricultural details across rural Texas or Mississippi. The resulting math was absolutely horrifying. In Germany, high-octane aviation fuel and diesel were so desperately scarce that elite panzer divisions were increasingly being towed to the front lines by horses, and the Luftwaffe was grounded. Yet here, the Americans were burning thousands of gallons of precious gasoline simply to shuttle prisoners back and forth to pick tomatoes, harvest sugarcane in Louisiana, and cut pulpwood in Maine. Deep existential anxiety began to replace their initial Prussian arrogance. They realized that the chilled soft drinks and the relaxed guards were not signs of a weak society. They were the terrifying symptoms of a nation so overwhelmingly resource-rich, so industrially untouched by the war, that it didn't even need to try. The American military machine was operating with an unending logistical might that made the entire German war effort look like a fragile, desperate, and ultimately doomed gamble. Recognizing that this logistical truth was slowly infecting the minds of their enlisted men, the die-hard Nazi loyalists decided they had to take violent control of the narrative, right under the noses of the U.S. Army. The true believers knew that the creeping Americanization of their men was a lethal threat to the future of the Reich. Hardcore Nazi officers, SS veterans, seamlessly blended into regular army units, and former Gestapo sympathizers established a ruthless, highly organized shadow hierarchy within the barbed wire fences. They understood that if the average soldier grew too comfortable with American democracy, the 80-cent wages, and the Sears Roebuck catalogs, the fighting spirit of the captive army would evaporate, rendering them useless for the eventual, promised counterattack. So, they launched a quiet, deadly civil war inside the borders of the United States. They systematically and strategically took control of the camp's internal administration by volunteering for key clerical, cooking, and leadership roles within the prisoner compounds. These hardliners positioned themselves as the official, indispensable liaisons to the American camp commanders. Once in power, they took absolute control of the camp mailroom, illegally opening and filtering out letters from home that contained bad news from the crumbling Russian front, or details of the devastating Allied bombing raids on German cities. They monopolized the camp radios, forcefully tuning them to shortwave propaganda broadcasts from Berlin and drowning out American news reports with blaring military marches. Most importantly, they instituted strict, unwavering ideological discipline, creating an atmosphere of total paranoia among the thousands of ordinary draftees who just wanted to survive the war in peace. If a prisoner bought too many American goods at the PX, read a smuggled American newspaper, or spoke too warmly to an American guard, he was immediately marked for investigation by a secret internal police force operating within the barracks. In the dead of night, long after the American guards had locked the outer perimeter and retreated to their administrative buildings, the Shadow War began. The Loyalists established what they called Ehrengerichte, illegal underground kangaroo courts of honor. These clandestine tribunals operated in the suffocating darkness of the barracks, actively identifying and prosecuting any prisoner suspected of anti-Nazi sentiments, defeatism, or the ultimate crime, collaboration with the Americans. A weary soldier who merely suggested out loud that Germany might lose the war, or who refused to snap to attention and give the Hitler salute during the internal morning roll call, would find himself violently dragged out of his bunk and forced to stand trial before a panel of highly indoctrinated peers. The charges were always the same: high treason against the fatherland. And the sentences handed down by these makeshift courts were executed with brutal, calculated efficiency, entirely hidden from the American authorities. The violence was swift, silent, and strictly disciplined. The enforcers did not use makeshift knives or weapons that would leave obvious, messy evidence and alert the American guards to a systemic problem. Instead, they relied on psychological terror and coordinated, crushing physical coercion. The most common method of enforcement was a terrifying practice known as the Holy Ghost beating. A targeted dissident prisoner would be ambushed in the isolated latrines or in his bunk late at night.
A heavy woolen blanket would be thrown over his head to muffle his screams and prevent him from identifying his attackers, and he would be beaten severely by multiple men using heavy wooden clogs or sandbags. When the bruised, bleeding, and terrified soldier showed up for the morning agricultural detail, he was frightened into absolute silence, routinely claiming to the baffled American camp doctors that he had simply fallen out of bed or tripped down the stairs. But for those deemed true traitors to the Reich, a beating was not enough. The shadow courts demanded absolute, permanent elimination. The hardliners engineered executions that were meticulously staged to look like tragic suicides. Men who grew too friendly with American democratic ideals, or who threatened to expose the internal Nazi network to the oblivious camp commanders, were handed a piece of rope in the dead of night and given a horrifying ultimatum. Hang yourself, or we will smuggle your name out of this camp and the Gestapo will murder your family back in Germany. The threat was credible, terrifying, and highly effective because the prisoners knew the camp mail system was fully compromised. In other instances, the violence was more direct, sudden, and impossible to hide. In Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a German corporal named Johannes Kunz was discovered passing a clandestine note to the Americans, suggesting a list of hardcore Nazis who were violently disrupting camp life. Within hours, the internal Nazi intelligence network intercepted the information. Kunz was dragged into a mess hall, subjected to a rapid, screaming kangaroo court, and brutally beaten to death by a frenzied mob of his fellow prisoners using heavy ceramic dining mugs and wooden benches. The American guards, stationed just outside the wire, noticed nothing out of the ordinary until the morning roll call revealed a battered corpse. This was not an isolated incident. Across the country, in camps from the deep woods of Maine to the deserts of Arizona, bodies were periodically found hanging from the rafters of the barracks or slumped lifelessly in the shower blocks. The psychological grip of the true believers was absolute. Men who had genuinely begun to doubt the Reich, who had their eyes opened by the staggering abundance of the camp store and the casual freedom of the American farmer, were violently forced back into line through sheer, unadulterated terror. The fascist ideology was policing itself, thousands of miles away from Berlin, successfully halting the creeping Americanization of the captive workforce. The most shocking aspect of this internal reign of terror wasn't merely that the Nazis attempted it. It was that for a remarkably long time, the United States military deliberately let it happen. The American response to this deadly civil war was heavily dictated by cold, bureaucratic pragmatism and an overwhelming national crisis. The Provost Marshal General's office, the military branch singularly responsible for the sprawling POW program, had two overwhelming, non-negotiable priorities: maintain a 0% escape rate and extract maximum daily labor output. By 1944, German prisoners were contributing over 20 million man-days of labor to the American economy. They were the only thing keeping the agricultural sector from total collapse. The military simply could not afford strikes, organized riots, or unrest inside the camps that would delay the harvest. When lower-ranking American intelligence officers and camp translators began to notice the bruises, intercepted the threatening notes, and actively warned camp commanders about the secret courts and the brutal beatings, the warnings were largely ignored, filed away, or actively suppressed. The higher military administration quickly realized that the easiest, most efficient way to run a camp of 3,000 hostile, bored enemy combatants was to outsource the internal discipline directly to the highest-ranking German officers. By strictly adhering to Article 43 of the Geneva Convention, which legally required captors to respect and utilize the existing military hierarchy of the prisoners, the United States effectively handed the keys of the camp interiors over to the Gestapo sympathizers. As one camp commander bluntly noted, the army was not running a political re-education facility. They were running a labor camp. The American camp commanders found, to their logistical delight,
that the hardcore Nazis were exceptionally good at keeping order. Under the command of the Loyalists, the barracks were always spotless for inspections. The men marched in perfect, quiet formation to the work trucks every dawn, and the crucial agricultural quotas were consistently, routinely met. If maintaining that perfect, frictionless operational efficiency meant turning a blind eye to the occasional, unexplained suicide in the latrines, many American officers were more than willing to accept the dark trade-off. They coldly prioritized the smooth functioning of the local wartime economy over the political beliefs and physical safety of the anti-Nazi captives. When a desperate prisoner approached an American guard begging for transfer or protection from the shadow courts, he was often labeled by the administration as a troublemaker, a malcontent who was disrupting the fragile peace of the camp. In many tragic cases, these anti-Nazi dissidents were transferred to specialized segregation camps, not to protect them, but to isolate them so they wouldn't upset the highly productive, Nazi-controlled labor force. The United States military had inadvertently created a bizarre, morally bankrupt paradox. They were fighting a total existential war against fascism in the ruins of Europe, while simultaneously protecting, enabling, and relying upon violent fascist power structures to pick cotton and harvest sugar beets in Alabama. The military had successfully utilized the captive enemy labor force to save the American harvest, navigating the immediate logistical crisis flawlessly. But as the bodies occasionally piled up in the camp morgues, military planners soon realized a chilling truth. Comfortable logistics, 80-cent wages, and access to ice cream alone could not magically deprogram violent, deeply entrenched extremists. The passive approach of consumer exposure was failing to break the hardliners. A much harsher, more deliberate reality check was coming. By late 1944, the War Department could no longer ignore the bloody reality of its own logistical compromises. The passive experiment of relying on 80-cent wages and overflowing canteen shelves to naturally democratize captive soldiers had failed to break the true believers. The hardcore Loyalists had successfully weaponized the Geneva Convention to maintain an iron grip on the barracks. In response, Washington authorized a highly classified, aggressive psychological counteroffensive known internally as the Intellectual Diversion Program. Almost overnight, the comfortable, predictable illusion of the stateside camp lifestyle was intentionally shattered. The American military administration actively targeted and dismantled the internal Nazi shadow networks, systematically stripping out identified extremists and transferring them to maximum security segregation compounds. With the hardline enforcers finally isolated, the military flooded the remaining prisoner populations with cold, unfiltered reality. The era of passive observation was over. A mandated, rigorous re-education had begun. The same men who had grown accustomed to spending their agricultural earnings on chilled sodas, ice cream, and fresh tobacco were suddenly confronted with a very different kind of American logistics, the mass distribution of uncensored information. The military began circulating an anti-Nazi German-language newspaper directly into the barracks. Prisoners who had been intentionally kept in the dark by their former commanders were suddenly required to read detailed, thoroughly documented intelligence reports charting the systematic destruction of the Third Reich. They tracked the relentless Allied bombing campaigns leveling the industrial centers where their own families still lived. But written reports could still be rationalized away as clever Allied propaganda. The true, devastating psychological collision occurred inside the camp cinemas. For months, these wooden theaters had been a place of casual weekend escapism, screening lighthearted Hollywood features. Now, attendance was mandatory, and the doors were locked behind the men. The lights dimmed, and the American projectionists rolled raw, unedited military footage captured by advancing Allied frontline units. The German soldiers sat in absolute, suffocating silence as the flickering black and white reels documented the liberation of the concentration camps. They were forced to look at the undeniable, mechanized atrocities committed in the name of the very ideology they had sworn to defend. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. These healthy, well-fed men, dressed in clean denim and sitting with pockets full of canteen coupons, were violently forced to reconcile their comfortable American captivity with the harrowing crimes of their government. The psychological armor of the German army was finally fracturing under the crushing weight of undeniable visual evidence. The aggressive re-education program had successfully planted heavy, inescapable seeds of guilt and doubt across the stateside camps. But for thousands of stubborn combat veterans, even the horrors projected on the silver screen were not enough to trigger a complete ideological surrender. That final, devastating blow would require something the Americans could never manufacture. They were waiting for the official word from Berlin. That official word finally blasted through the camp loudspeakers on the afternoon of May 8, 1945. From the pine forests of Camp Ruston in Louisiana to the high desert of Fort Robinson in Nebraska, the shortwave radios were no longer broadcasting defiance from Berlin. Instead, the voice of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz echoed across the wooden barracks, announcing the unconditional surrender of the German armed forces and the total collapse of the Third Reich. In a single, shattering instant, the psychological architecture that had governed over 370,000 men vanished into thin air. The iron-fisted command structure of the shadow courts, the whispered threats of Gestapo retribution, and the arrogant conviction of ultimate victory were erased by a static-heavy broadcast. The emotional fallout inside the barbed wire enclosures was immediate and catastrophic. For the hardcore believers who had spent years enforcing rigid Nazi discipline, the surrender was not merely a military defeat, it was the irreversible death of their entire worldview. Across the country, the stoic facade of the Wehrmacht completely disintegrated. American guards observed hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps sitting on the wooden steps of the barracks, weeping uncontrollably. In the camp canteens, the very places where these men had spent the last 2 years casually purchasing fresh citrus, Virginia tobacco, and chilled Coca-Cola, the atmosphere turned to one of suffocating despair. Soldiers stood numbly among the shelves of endless American abundance, the physical reality of their captors' untouched industrial wealth, mocking the absolute ruin of their homeland. In several installations, this psychological collapse manifested in desperate acts of purging. At Camp Trinidad in Colorado and Camp Concordia in Kansas, prisoners gathered in the dirt courtyards not to protest their American captors, but to violently reject their own former identities. Men stripped off their service tunics, ripped away their swastika patches, and threw their decorations, including cherished iron crosses earned in North Africa or Russia, into makeshift bonfires. The uniforms they had worn with such arrogant pride were reduced to ash in the American spring wind, burned in a collective surge of disgust toward the regime that had deceived them. Yet the most agonizing torment was the sudden, horrifying realization of their own irrelevance. As the unvarnished truth of Europe's devastation flooded the camps, the captives faced a crushing wave of survivors' guilt. For 2 or 3 years, these men had lived in absolute physical safety. They had worked steady agricultural hours under the warm sun of the American South and Midwest. They had played organized soccer on weekends, earned reliable wages, and casually indulged in ice cream and sweets while insulated by the Geneva Convention. Now, they were forced to confront the horrific cost of their comfortable captivity. While they were lounging in American canteens and ordering from mail-order catalogs, their families had frozen in unheated cellars, starved under collapsing distribution networks, and perished under the relentless bombardment of Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. They had given their loyalty to a regime that promised global dominion, only to sit out the end of the war as well-fed farmhands for the very democracy they had been trained to despise. The myth of the invincible 1,000-year empire died not in a glorious final battle, but in the sterile, well-stocked aisles of an American camp store, leaving hundreds of thousands of men to face the ruins of their former lives. When the Afrika Korps veteran, who had first stepped off the train at Camp Aliceville, finally returned to Germany in the late 1940s, he did not find the glorious 1,000-year empire he had fought for. He stepped off another transport, this time into a landscape of pulverized brick, twisted steel and starving civilians. But he also did not return as the hardened, indoctrinated fascist he had been when he first arrived in Alabama. Like hundreds of thousands of his fellow repatriated prisoners, his worldview had not been beaten out of him by interrogators or broken by forced starvation. It had been systematically dismantled by time, by facts, and by the relentless, quiet crush of American logistics. The military planners who set up the camp canteens and instituted the 80-cent daily wages never intended them to be a magical psychological cure for Nazism. In their desperate rush to solve a massive logistical bottleneck and appease the rigid dictates of the Geneva Convention, the War Department had simply built a functional, by-the-book administrative machine. But in doing so, they had accidentally subjected their captives to a devastating historical experiment. The chilled Coca-Cola, the durable denim, and the casual freedom of the agricultural fields served as undeniable material proof of a system that could vastly outproduce and outlive totalitarianism. The state-sponsored lie of a weak, degenerate democracy had completely collapsed, not just under the weight of Allied bombs, but under the sheer, boring abundance of the American home front. This unprecedented internment program proved that deep-rooted ideological fanaticism cannot be permanently defeated by punishment and retribution alone. A fanatic can always endure physical suffering. In fact, suffering often only hardens their resolve and validates their twisted sense of victimhood. To truly break an indoctrinated mind, it requires something much harder to dismiss. It requires exposing the enemy to a functioning, irrefutable alternative. A daily reality so overwhelmingly stable, efficient, and unbothered that it renders their previous fanatical beliefs utterly absurd. The men who returned to clear the rubble and eventually rebuild the shattered German state brought with them a profound, uncomfortable understanding of how the global war of ideas was ultimately decided. They knew that the conflict was won not just through the courage of combat troops, but through the overwhelming, irrefutable weight of everyday reality. This realization leaves us with one final, lasting image of the war's true logistical nature. In the end, the most insidious weapon against the myth of Aryan supremacy was not just the Allied bomber fleet leveling cities from above, but the quiet, devastating reality of a 10-cent bottle of soda in a free market. The Third Reich spent a decade constructing an elaborate, blood-soaked illusion of racial and military dominance, yet it was ultimately undone by the undeniable, mundane machinery of American consumerism and agricultural logistics. For the hundreds of thousands of prisoners who walked out of those rural camps, the true surrender occurred the moment they realized that a democracy could wage a total global war without ever turning off the lights or emptying the shelves back home.